By 1864, the town of Wilmington in southern North Carolina was one of the most important cities in the Confederacy. All other ports had been captured or rendered useless for importing war material, and Wilmington alone stood as a port for ships running the Union naval blockade. Wilmington was strategically located for blockade running. It was situated up the Chpt River, which was very wide and deep at this point. It was also close to the friendly ports of Bermuda and Nassau, where Confederate cotton was traded for war material such as gunpowder, turpentine, rifles and cannons. Most importantly, the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad provided a quick route to Northern Virginia and Robert E. Lee's army. Blockade-running ships were generally fast side-wheelers with a shallow draft to pass through the inlets around the mouth of the Chpt. To protect Wilmington, the Confederates built a large number of forts around the Chpt. These included Fort Holmes and Fort Campbell at the Old Inlet, in addition to Fort Caswell and Fort Johnston that were built before the war. Fort Anderson was built further up the river in the ruins of colonial-era Brunswick Town. Many smaller batteries, mounting only 1 or 2 cannon, were built along the coast. Obstructions were placed in the waterways, and blockade runners were instructed on how to avoid them. The biggest of all the forts was Fort Fisher, which guarded New Inlet. Most of the fort has eroded into the sea, and only about 10% of the fort remains. Construction started in 1861. The fort was a 2-sided earthwork structure with bomb-proof bunkers inside the walls. A large sand mound 60 feet high, called the Mound Battery, dominated the ocean for miles. A beacon was set atop the Mound Battery to act as a guide for blockade runners at night. This beacon was only flashed on briefly and when the runner was close to the fort. The fortifications were so strong that one Confederate officer said, "These are not fortifications, but 50fications at least." The Confederates also built 3 150-foot class ironclads, like these seen here, to defend Wilmington, but they were not successful. The CSS Raleigh was poorly constructed, but in May of 1864 made one foray against the Union blockaders. On her way back to port, she got stuck on a sandbar, broke in 2 and sank. The CSS North Carolina was even less successful. Her machinery was faulty and she was hard to steer, so she stayed moored at the dock in the town of Smithville. Her hull became infested with shipworms, and in September 1864 she sprung a leak and sank. The 3rd ironclad, the CSS Wilmington, was never completed. Occasionally, Confederate commerce raiders operated out of Wilmington. The raider CSS Tallahassee broke out into the North Atlantic in August 1864 and sank 26 Union merchant ships. Late that October, the Tallahassee, renamed Olustee, and the CSS Chickamauga steamed through a rain of cannonballs to prey on shipping along the east coast. The Chickamauga sank 6 ships, the Olustee 7. But Confederate commanders in Wilmington grew nervous that the raiders would incite the Union to send more ships to Wilmington, thus tightening the blockade. The Olustee was converted into a blockade runner, and the Chickamauga was used as a gunboat to help defend Wilmington. The Union blockade was divided into 4 squadrons. The North Atlantic Squadron dealt with the North Carolina and Virginia coasts. The Union blockade of Wilmington started out with 1 ship, the steamer USS Daylight. Several other slow gunboats were later posted outside of Wilmington. These ships were far too slow to catch a speedy blockade runner, and to make matters worse they often cruised with their engines running low to save coal. It took a long time to get a steam engine up to full speed, by which the runner would usually be gone. In one case, 2 blockade runners sped past an idle Union gunboat, blowing their steam whistles. The Union blockade became more effective as the war went on. In the shipping lanes farther out to sea, fast cruisers patrolled, looking to catch any ships that slipped past the blockaders at the inlets. Captured blockade runners were armed and used to patrol closer to shore. The slower gunboats concentrated on the inlets, but made sure to stay out of range of the guns of the Confederate forts. Despite their efforts, the Union Navy never managed to cut off the flow of supplies. Blockade running was dangerous, and many blockaders were captured or destroyed. Many ran aground hugging the coast at night. The cargo of a captured runner was sold at auction, and the money split amongst the crew of the capturing vessel, providing extra incentive for Union sailors. But running the blockade was also profitable because a ship could pay for itself in a few trips. However, many runners carried expensive commodities like fine liquor that would bring the most profit rather than the weapons and war material the Confederacy needed. Many blockade-running captains were off-duty British Navy officers seeking thrills. Other runners, such as the Advance Senior, were owned and operated by the state of North Carolina or the Confederate government to ensure a steady supply of desperately needed war materials. In the late summer of 1862, the blockade runner Chpt brought yellow fever to Wilmington. The resulting epidemic raged for months until winter killed the mosquitoes that spread the disease. Over 700 people were killed out of 1,500 sickened. After the epidemic, all blockade runners were quarantined at Smithville before their crews were allowed on shore. The most famous blockade-running captain was Lieutenant John Wilkinson, a Confederate naval officer. He was a crafty man with a big bag of tricks, one of which was to fire copies of the signal rockets used by blockaders to sow confusion. On another mission he disguised his runner as a Union supply vessel. Wilkinson commanded the runner Robert E. Lee, which was owned by the Confederate government. It would make 21 trips before being captured. Wilkinson was not in command of the Robert E. Lee when she was captured outside of Wilmington. Later, he would command a raider CSS Chickamauga before going back to blockade running. He would never be caught by federal blockaders, and when the war ended he turned his ship over to the chief Confederate official in Liverpool, England.